Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
The first 100 days of President Donald Trump's second term might be the most tumultuous first 100 days of any president. He certainly came in prepared to move his agenda forward, no matter what barriers to it existed. This is Kurt Repenchek, your host at the National Parks Traveler. We don't usually discuss presidential politics, but President Trump has released a blizzard of executive orders and directives touching all corners of the federal government, including the National Park Service. What we have seen so far is a loss of perhaps 2,500 Park Service employees, and along with them some crucial institutional knowledge. Any day we expect to hear of a further reduction in force of the Park Service, if it's not already in the works. The President and the Republican Congress have also taken aim at environmental laws and regulations, determined, it seems, to weaken the Endangered Species Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, among others, and there's been talk about selling off federal lands. And, of course, Interior Secretary Doug Burgum has made it clear that he wants to see more coal mined and more oil and gas reserves tapped. The administration also is taking aim at agency responses to climate change, and the President has ordered the militarization of federal lands, including national park lands, along the country's southern border with Mexico. To get a take on what's going on and what the impacts might be, we're joined today by U.S. Representative Jared Huffman, the ranking Democrat on the House Natural Resources Committee. We'll be back in a minute with the Congressman.
Smokey's Life. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. Washington's National Park Fund is the official philanthropic partner serving Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. WNPF raises funds for scientific research, youth experiences, volunteer programs, and projects that preserve and protect these national parks in Washington state. Learn how you can help at WNPF.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Support from readers and listeners like you make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Welcome to the Traveler, Congressman.
Great to be with you, Kurt. Thanks for having me.
I appreciate you making time. Between House votes and Zoom technology, it's great to catch up with you.
Yes, it is. It's a miracle that we've finally made it work.
It truly is. It truly is. We'll get right down into it. I mean, it's just been a crazy 100 days in terms of the environment and the Park Service and the park system and all public land agencies. I'll just throw it out there. What are your thoughts on the administration's approach to federal land management agencies? What is their end game?
I think it's chaos in a nutshell. And it's the same thing that we see across the board, from their economic policy to their social policy to their foreign policy. Chaos is the point. Chaos is the feature. And it is frankly how authoritarians divide us and overwhelm us and consolidate power. So that may be a little bit of an academic answer to your question, but I think it's the moment we're in, and no part of government is untouched by that agenda, including our public lands.
No, that's true for sure. I'm sitting here watching my retirement portfolio dwindle down as the tariffs continue to wreak havoc with the world economy. But sticking around, sticking close to the public lands issue, and the national parks Do you have a clear sense of what they're trying to do in terms of reducing the Park Service staff and the Interior Secretary's order to the Park Service acting director to ensure that parks are open and that visitors have a good time? You can only do so much with so few resources.
Obviously. And of course, between the reductions in force that we know they're underway right now and more are coming, the fork in the road stuff, the various purges and harassment of certain employees. I mean, it's going to be difficult for any national park to make it through this summer with any semblance of the level of service and stewardship that we expect. So, what you asked, what is their agenda for the national parks? I think for national parks and public lands, it's to rethink many of the concepts we've taken for granted for decades, if not hundreds of years, when it comes to the federal role in public lands. They don't like federal public lands. They want to spin things off and privatize them and monetize them. They don't subscribe to this idea of an intergenerational trust where we do things that, might not immediately give us benefits, but will benefit our children and grandchildren. This is a here and now consumptive, greed-focused worldview that has the reins in Washington right now. And so much of our federal policy with parks and public lands is just at odds with the way they view the world.
It really is, and you go back. I hate to talk about this, but back in I want to say the 1980s, I was working for the Associated Press in Wyoming. I ran the Wyoming operation there, and one of my interviews at the time was with William Perry Penley. At the time, he was the head of the Mountain States Legal Foundation and a big proponent of multiple use of federal lands. Today, of course, he is the architect of the chapter in Project 2025 on the Interior Department. And I guess it's his hand that we're seeing play it out in the public lands arena.
Definitely. His fingerprints are all over this stuff, but he's not alone. There are others who've been pushing this agenda for a long time, and folks like David Bernhardt and the rest. So, look, these are people who fundamentally look at public lands as something to be consumed and monetized, like everything else. You even see the new Interior Secretary Doug Burgum talking about, the thinking of our public lands as something on a balance sheet, and that if we could just figure out a way to monetize that balance sheet, that we would take care of the debt and the deficit, and we would have this surplus. They talk about creating a sovereign wealth fund that I'm sure would be part of monetizing that balance sheet. And it is deeply troubling to those of us that don't think public lands should be about just consumption and making a dollar in the here and now. We see it as something more intrinsically valuable and an intergenerational trust.
Well, not just that. If you listen to my past week's interview with Michael Sukup, who was the chief scientist for the Park Service, there's the natural resources and what the Interior Secretary is doing in ordering the Park Service to keep parks operating. As the visitors see the Park Service, we're going to lose a lot of natural resource science, monitoring, inventorying to track what's going on. I've argued for many years, and I keep threatening to do a story, and hopefully one of these days I will. I mean, there is incredible value in those natural resources. I mean, certainly there's economic value in tourism, but you look at the landscapes that provide for, in some cases, snow fences. The bristlecone pines and the whitebark pines, and the role they serve in helping our watersheds and whatnot. And you can just go on and on and on. And that people have done research on the value of grizzly bears, the value of wolves, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And to try and ignore that value really is concerning to me.
Yeah, the idea that you would drop everything and just make sure that, tourists have a good visiting experience. First of all, I don't think even that can work with the kind of personnel cuts and just operational challenges that they're facing. But second, you're right. There are other values beyond just, having clean restrooms and safe parking lots for tourists. And the mission of our Park Service has always been, broader than just that.
We talk about level of service and wondering about the future of the parks and the Park Service. I had conversations with somebody who was high up in the Park Service during the first Trump administration. And there were conversations then about, possibly getting rid of some units of the park system or somehow privatizing it, letting concessionaires run more operations, and maybe in some of the smaller parks that only have a handful of full-time employees, let them take over the whole thing. With the decline in the ranks of the Park Service, do you think that's one of the end goals?
It seems to be the end goal for so many federal agencies. Basically, hollow them out, set them up for failure, and then, either destroy them or completely reimagine them and, spin them out to either the states or the private sector. Parks are caught up in this same drill that you're seeing, at the Department of Education, at so many other federal agencies right now as part of this, extreme right-wing vision.
You're the ranking Democrat on the House Natural Resources Committee. You have a close relationships, I'm sure, with the Republicans on the committee. Is that what they want? Do you think there's a majority in the Republican Party that wants to go in that direction?
I don't think a majority, no, but I think there are a few, and there always have been a few, extreme ideologues who subscribe to this view. So they're the folks that have the energy and the power right now in this MAGA moment. And I think everyone else is either along for the ride or, just sort of afraid to speak up.
It was interesting. There was an effort in the Senate a couple weeks ago to get the majority to oppose federal lands sale of federal lands, and the majority wasn't there, which was kind of surprising. Is
That
that
was an
something that's
interesting test, right? But if push came to shove, if some sort of sell-off of federal lands ends up being part of this budget reconciliation bill that will come together in the next few weeks, and Donald Trump really leans in and starts twisting arms, I think you might get a different answer.
yeah, that'll be interesting. I haven't heard exactly what the Interior Secretary wants to sell specifically, but I've heard mention of selling some lands off for housing and, of course, oil and gas development and coal mining, hard rock mining. I wonder if they sell off lands for housing, whether it's going to be affordable housing or it's going to be starter castles.
Well, and yeah, we're going to want to look deeply into, just who has economic interests in those decisions and those locations, and whether any of them are in this administration or are donors to President Trump or others. So, yeah, we're going to want to be on high alert for all of that. But their so-called task force to produce a report on all of this was due to announce the details of which federal public lands were going to be sold off for housing, and I have yet to see that information. And I think it was due last week to the National Economic Council.
Interesting. Hadn't heard about that. Along with what's going on to the federal land management agencies, some would argue there's a lot of damage being done to environmental regulations and laws. No?
I think it's just self-evident that is happening. Everything from declaring that wrecking habitat for endangered species, no longer is to be considered a take of endangered species, to the various freezes and rollbacks. I mean, it's a wrecking ball.
It really is. And, with the numbers in Congress, is there a realistic expectation that some of these can be changed, can be stopped?
It will be interesting to see how some of this is packaged. They're probably too smart to just take on something like repealing the Endangered Species Act, which is still very broadly popular. And so what they'll do is just chip away in some very serious ways. Bruce Westerman, my Republican counterpart on the Natural Resource Committee, has a bill that basically takes all of the parts of the ESA that have teeth in them, the listing of species, the ability to go to court and enforce violations, the designations of critical habitat, and it makes it almost impossible to do any of those things. And then it, basically throws down obstacles and redefines what best available science means in a way that will please industry and make it so that the ESA is no longer inconvenient for them when they push their polluting projects forward.
Do you have any concerns that they might go after the National Environmental Policy Act?
Not just concerns, they're going after it in a very obvious and troubling way. And they've been doing it for some time. So, we just seem to pass one provision after another in the name of streamlining or permitting reform or any number of other things designed to make it harder for communities who are impacted by industry pollution to have a voice in those decisions.
Well, not only that for industry, they're also pushing logging, fast track logging production on public lands.
Yeah, they are. That you may be referring to the Fix Our Forest Act. They come up with these names that are a little bit of gaslighting too. That passed out of the House over my opposition and had some very troubling provisions that I think you're right were about clearing the way for backcountry commercial logging while pretending to be about fire resilience for communities. And it was pretty cynical in that regard. But it did include some good things on fire safety. And I'm happy to say that the Senate has been working on improvements to that bill and some safeguards that I think would fix the problem you're referring to. So I'm trying to keep an open mind and see what comes out of the Senate. I hope it'll be something that undoes some of the bad parts and gets to the good parts that we all should be able to support.
Yeah, I'm curious. Many national parks in the western half of the country are surrounded by national forests. In fact, even in the eastern part of the country, you look at the Great Smoky Mountains or Shenandoah, and they're all surrounded by national forests. What sort of logging might this bill aim for in those forests?
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know if you want to call it logging, but there are forest treatments, fuel load reduction treatments in and around national parks that need to happen. Many of our so I represent Redwood National Park, for example,
Mm-hmm.
and it's kind of an interesting model. It's both a national and a state park that kind of work together. But a lot of those lands came into the Park Service after being logged over by private industry and then replanted in sort of an even age management scheme that the tree farms that they leave in their wake after clear cuts. And so many of the areas of Redwood National and State Parks are not healthy forests. They're very dense, even age forests where every tree is the same height. They're kind of spindly. They're too close together. And so we're doing some active treatments there to thin out those areas and give trees a chance to become big, fat, old growth trees, over the next 100 years and
Mm-hmm.
to, comprise the kind of healthy forests that we want to see at Redwood National Park. That's good stuff, and it'll also be good for fire resilience.
So there is a good, healthy way to manage forests and get some logging done at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. Some of those trees will be, harvested and put to good use by mills and timber companies. But, the point of it is to build a healthy forest, not to have a tree farm. And
Right.
that's an important distinction. Other work that needs to happen in and around national parks are things like shaded fuel breaks, where you do need to do some thinning out to make sure that a fire can be contained and we can maintain public safety. But that's a far cry from commercial scale clear cutting and other things that some folks would love to do.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. A few years ago, I did a story about climate change and how it was producing more erratic, more intense wildfires, and what some of the national parks were doing to slow it down. At Crater Lake, for instance, I know they were trying to thin out and clear the underbrush along the road, so firefighters could get in there without having to leapfrog these massive trees. And at Yellowstone, they were just masticating all the ground fuels and leaving kind of a mulch behind. But that's a whole different cry from clear cutting and what that might result in. I'm also concerned, or would like to get your view on the administration's efforts to rescind the Bureau of Land Management's public lands rule. I mean, that was a rule that reiterated that conservation is a key component of the Bureau of Land Management's multiple use mission. If they get rid of that, what's the outcome?
Yeah, it says a lot that something like just affirming that conservation is one of the management values for BLM would be, radical and threatening. But to these folks, that is. They believe that our public lands, we've been talking a little bit about this, are just there for the taking. There's something where money needs to be made. Mining industry, timber industry, any others. I mean, it used to be railroads, right? So it's just a fundamentally short-sighted worldview, I believe. And those of us who think that we have an intergenerational trust and that we owe it to future generations to take care of these public lands should defend the conservation rule and this very simple proposition that conservation is one of the multiple uses that BLM ought to be guided by in managing its lands.
No, especially in the West, lots of different uses for the public lands, and to privatize them or sell them off or open them up for mining and development really affects a lot of local communities. I know we had a story a few weeks back about 300 elected officials across the West were writing a letter to the Interior Secretary basically pleading not to upset the recreation tourism industry that these public lands provide for so many communities.
Yeah,
You
and
know,
it's part of what makes America unique, and I would argue great. I mean, there are many countries around the world where you don't have these public lands that are protected from short-sighted development and exploitation and destruction. We should be proud of that. And the truth is, whether you say that conservation is part of BLM's mission or not, BLM has embraced conservation as a value for a long, long time. I represent a number of wilderness areas and really special pristine places managed by BLM. So it just shouldn't be radical or controversial in any way to just make it official and give them the part of their mission that they already embrace.
and it's got to be hard working for these agencies that every 4 years or every 8 years you can get a 180-degree change in what your mission is.
Yeah, that's true. And we're seeing that 180 degrees right now. They're not only swinging the pendulum right now, they're shooting it so far off to the right that it's going to break and not be able to swing back, and that's kind of their goal.
Good to know, I guess. Climate change, sir. I understand that the president has ordered the attorney general to look out across the 50 states and identify any states that have laws purporting to address climate change or involving environmental, social, and governance initiatives, environmental justice, carbon or greenhouse gas emissions. What's the deal with that?
Yeah, it's like they took a page out of Mao's Cultural Revolution in, 1950s China or something. They are just on this mission to, scour through documents and websites. And, their answer to the climate crisis is to just delete all the words that talk about it, fire all the scientists that talk about it as if that is going to make it go away. Look, it's really dystopic. I never imagined that our country would ever be under the control of such an ignorant and sweeping authoritarianism, but that's where we are, and the climate crisis is one of many ways in which this agenda is rolling out.
possibly, fortunately, in 2 years, we'll have another election, midterm election, and we could see a big swing in Congress. Whether we do or not, what type of damage is being done to these agencies and to the environmental regulations and to efforts to stem the flow of climate change?
Yeah, I think that's really the important question, because we have seen political swings in the past as different parties win elections and take power and try to advance their priorities. This one is very different because they are not only trying to move their policies and priorities forward, they are trying to go back and destroy the things that preceded them and make it so that the country can never go back to that. And so climate science, public health science, any number of other policies are part of that. And it is this very authoritarian, hyper-masculine attempt to fundamentally change and forever control the direction of the country.
It seems like some of these things are being done without any concern for what will happen on the ground. And by that, I'm referring to what's being done to NOAA and to the National Weather Service. We had a story a few weeks ago. Obviously last fall, we saw Hurricane Helene do something that hurricanes usually don't do, and that's jump from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up into Appalachia, and the damage that was done there. And so our story kind of focused on not only the change in weather patterns and weather behavior, but what is being stripped away from the National Weather Service and NOAA in terms of forecasting. And I know that was a concern that you spoke out on.
I'm very concerned about that. NOAA is one of those agencies that Americans depend on without even knowing they depend on it. When we check our weather forecast, when we have free public access to, all of these forecasts and predictions, our firefighters depend on it so that, they can put out red flag warnings when we're going to be at super high risk of wildfire. We depend on NOAA science for maritime safety to make sure that we have ocean mapping and ocean current data so that ships don't run aground. And even our Defense Department depends on it to make sure submarines don't, ground themselves or go into the wrong places. So it's just so vital and such a success, something that our government does for us. And that's threatening to these folks who hate government and, don't want anything that you can make a buck on to be done by the government when it can be spun off to, the oligarchs and monetize. That's what's going on with NOAA. They're trying to, kind of sell it off in pieces so that Elon Musk can take over weather forecasting and others can take over the parts of it that can make money and, come what may, for all the calamity that will ensue.
Yeah, I saw AccuWeather wasn't really concerned about what was happening to NOAA. I guess they see that as an opportunity to expand their operations.
Yep.
Have you heard any rumblings among those on the other side of the aisle that enough is enough? I mean, certainly congressional delegations from the Southeast are still suffering. Their constituents are still suffering from what Helene delivered. Are they not concerned about what's going on with NOAA?
It's really hard for me to assess that, Kurt. I mean, don't underestimate the power of this ideological moment and this political moment in the Republican universe. I mean, they have their own information ecosystem, their own media networks, and it's almost like another reality, another planet. They don't have conversations like the one you and I are having right now. They hear, Pendley and his view of the world, and on these issues like FEMA and climate impacts. Yeah, they can be at ground zero in North Carolina, but all the information they get is suggesting that FEMA is part of the problem, and so they can buy in to this extreme agenda of getting rid of FEMA and cutting budgets and destroying NOAA and its weather forecasting, and somehow they can come to believe that this is the way forward because they trust Donald Trump, and they live in an information silo.
Yeah, that's frightening in the 21st century to think that's possible. Another thing that's kind of outside of natural resources, but it's concerning, is Schedule F. They used to call it, I'm not sure what we're calling it in this Trump presidency, but I know he wants to get rid of civil service protections for a lot of people across the federal government, and what some are calling install loyalists.
Mm-hmm.
That would be tragic, no?
It's another one of these things you take for granted, right? We've had a professional civil service for over 100 years because, folks back at the turn of the last century figured out that the spoils system, where politicians just hired all their family and their buddies every time they won an election, was really corrupt. And it led to an incompetent government, and that we needed to have a professional, non-political class of federal employees, whether they were postmasters or food inspectors or any number of other jobs. And it has worked really well for all of these decades. But this was one of the more controversial parts of Project 2025 that you referenced a while ago, this Schedule F reform. It was only calling for something like 40 or 50,000 federal employees to be reclassified and purged. Donald Trump took Project 2025 and said, hold my beer. No one ever contemplated that he would bring in someone like Elon Musk, hand him the keys to the entire federal government pretty much, and just turn him loose with a chainsaw. And so they have blasted past the numbers that were mentioned in Project 2025. We haven't yet gotten to the point of them rehiring the sort of MAGA trained replacements that Project 2025 contemplates. That'll be the next step. But the purge is far more vast than anything Project 2025 contemplated.
Well, and you think about the public lands, and if all the top management were removed in favor of loyalists, what might we see? You think about the BLM lands, you think about the forests, and of course the national parks, and you'd have to wonder if everything would be tilted towards recreation and industry, multiple use, as Perry Pendley would like to see.
Well, and among those, the big thumb on the scale will be for industry and not recreation even. So it's about making money.
Yeah, so you think about all what goes on out of sight. As I mentioned earlier, natural resource inventory and monitoring, so you know what changes are happening, and you can try and anticipate things and figure out ways to deal with them. Just to let that stuff go without any observation is kind of concerning.
Yeah, a lot of science, a lot of data sets. They're being scrapped right now, and it's breathtakingly irresponsible. Some of these data sets go back decades, and people count on them for things that keep us safe, for things that help us manage fisheries and do other mission critical things. And these short-sighted folks in hoodies at Doge have no idea what they're cutting or who it's going to hurt. They are just gleefully ripping through federal agencies and federal budgets. And this Congress, unfortunately, is going along with it.
Well, yeah, you just imagine if the political roles were reversed. There's no way that the Republicans would sit quietly by if this was a Democratic president orchestrating these things without concern for congressional oversight.
Yeah, they would. The consolidation of power that we have seen would trouble them greatly if a Democrat were trying to do it.
One thing I've been wondering about is, speaking of Doge, and they've gone through and they've looked at all these facilities across the country, all kinds of different agencies, but certainly the National Park Service, they've singled out more than a few facilities that they would like to see closed. Places like the entire headquarters for the Southeast Utah Group, which the Park Service oversees, Canyonlands and Arches National Park, and Hovenweep and Natural Bridges National Monument, and over in Harper's Ferry, there's a fascinating cultural and historical resource operation there that does restoration and preservation. And these types of facilities across the country that DOJ wants to close, I haven't seen what they would replace them with. Where would they move these people? Where would they move these operations? Have you heard any discussions of that?
Well, I'm sure that they don't have a good answer to that question. But you are touching on the other part of this wrecking ball that is so disturbing, which is the kind of rewriting and the canceling of history. That is also part of our national parks mission, right? We are supposed to be telling the honest history of this country, including with Native Americans and with the Civil War and any number of things that we need to be able to trust what the rangers and interpreters and historians at our national parks tell the visitors. And what this administration wants to do is to get rid of all that and just present a whitewashed version of history that America is great and has always been wonderful and was never racist or committed genocide or anything like that.
Every year, the Traveler does a threatened and endangered parks series of stories that looks out across the system and tries to identify impacts such as climate change or sea level rise. One of the stories I did back in January looked at the political transformation and the ramifications. And one of the individuals I talked to was Patrick Gonzalez, who during the first Trump administration refused to sit quietly by and watch what was going on. And in talking to me for my story, he said one of his greatest concerns were that officials would self-censor themselves. And we're certainly seeing that in the Park Service and the Forest Service, and people are too afraid to speak out. What can be done about that? I mean, as you referred to, trying to erase history, and the Park Service just glibly goes along with it.
This is one of the more chilling and disturbing parts of the moment that we're in, Kurt. I see it happening everywhere I look. I was just, I'm here in my district this week, and I've been meeting with all kinds of stakeholders from Native American tribes to rural health clinics to food banks and others, who often depend on federal grants to do the work that they do. All of them are scouring their correspondence with federal agencies. They're scouring their grant applications and documents to try to avoid triggering the Trump administration on DEI, on wokeness, on sustainability and climate science. They're recharacterizing all of this stuff. So this phenomenon of anticipatory obedience is happening in a big way right now, and that's just deeply disturbing in a democracy. It's really almost unrecognizable as the United States of America.
It's chilling.
Yeah.
You read the national media in the political sections of the newspapers and magazines, and they talk about the Democratic Party not having a cohesive approach to dealing with the Trump administration. I mean, what's your response to that?
Well, the Democratic Party is a complex organism, and I am unable to speak for all the different arms of it. But I will just tell you, as one Democrat, I think I'm pretty clear on what this moment is, what is at stake, and what we've got to do to prevent it from turning our country into something really dark and unrecognizable. And I'm fighting with everything I got. Not everyone sees it that way. There are some folks who would like to wish it away, who would like to think that, it's all overblown or, pearl clutching or whatever. But I feel like it's dangerous to not learn the lessons of history and to not recognize these incredible echoes of history that are right in front of our eyes.
Well, let's narrow that question down a little bit to the House Natural Resources Committee.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, the Democrats are in the minority there, but just the same, is there a strategy that you can take to somehow slow or stop the destruction of some of these federal agencies and these environmental regulations and laws?
Now, you have to have that strategy. I'm not going to lay it out in great detail for you on this
Come on,
podcast,
sir.
but look, if I can slow them down and complicate their attempts to completely destroy our bedrock environmental laws, to make irreversibly damaging decisions for our public lands and public resources, I'm going to do that in every way I can. And it's a big part of, I wish I was in the majority. When you're in the minority, and bad things are happening by the majority, that's what you do.
Yeah, well, it's going to be interesting. That's Congressman Jared Huffman, a Democrat from California, who is the ranking Democrat on the House Natural Resources Committee. Sir, thanks so much for joining me today. Anything you want to add before you get back to meeting with your constituents?
No, thanks. Thank you for having me. And, thank you for your passion for our national parks, and for your listeners caring enough about national parks to be part of this wonderful community that values this uniquely American thing. I just think it's fantastic that you have the following and the audience that you do, and probably that is a bipartisan and nonpartisan audience. In many cases, it ought to be. I mean, my goodness, everybody loves our national parks. So, and I hope that we can get out of this political dysfunction and get back to maybe being a country where we can at least agree with each other that our national park system and the values that it protects and advances is just a great thing about our country that we all ought to cherish and support.
Yeah, we'll see. It'll be interesting. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it interesting. Next week, our guest is scheduled to be Walt Dabney, a longtime National Park Service employee and superintendent who also ran Texas's state park system and now has been working to teach how the United States acquired its public lands, the movement to transfer them to state control, and why this could lead to their sale to private owners, permanently eliminating public access. I'm sure it will be an interesting and illuminating discussion. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.